He couldn't see the man standing at the cage, but the moment that voice, that gentle, aged, broken by time, spoke his name, the blind German shepherd began to cry, not bark, not whine, cry. It had been 3 years since Shadow vanished after the car crash, 3 years of silence, 3 years of waiting, and now, across a crowded shelter, his ears caught something no one else could, the sound of home. What happened next would stir an entire courtroom, bring a quiet child back to life, and remind all of us that some bonds, no matter how lost, are never truly broken, because when God writes a story, even a blind dog can find his way back, by heart. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. It was a wind-bitten morning in Harbor Ridge, a quiet coastal town along the jagged edges of southern Maine. The fog hadn't lifted since dawn. It clung to the rooftops and rolled over the sidewalks like breath on glass. The smell of brine and damp cedar floated through the crisp spring air as seagulls cried overhead. Henry Cole, wrapped in a worn olive-green coat and knitted scarf, walked slowly toward the Harbor Ridge Animal Shelter. His gait had a stiffness born not of injury, but of time. At 65, Henry was a man carved by storms, the literal kind and the ones you never see coming, tall and wiry. Henry's silver beard was trimmed, but his pale blue eyes carried a weight too quiet to name. He was once a coastal rescue officer, a man who ran into waves when others ran away. But that was before he lost Margaret, before the silence in his cottage by the sea became louder than the storms he'd once conquered. Margaret had been the light in his lighthouse, and after she died 3 years ago, something in him dimmed too. That morning, Henry hadn't planned to adopt. He just wanted to look, to feel something stir. If only a flicker. The shelter's bell rang low and hollow as he stepped inside. "Good morning," greeted a woman behind the desk. Sarah Briggs looked up from her clipboard. In her late 30s, Sarah was the shelter manager, tall, with curly dark hair often tied into a bun that never stayed. She had gentle brown eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, the kind of person who could soothe a feral cat or discipline a stubborn retriever with the same measured calm. Years of working in animal rescue had left a quiet sadness behind her smiles, a shadow born from witnessing abandonment too many times. "I'm just looking," Henry murmured, nodding toward the kennels. "Take your time," Sarah replied, her voice warm but distant, as if she could already guess he wasn't ready. The shelter hallway echoed with the barks and yelps of dogs vying for attention, tails thudding against metal bars. Henry passed kennel after kennel, seniors curled in blankets, excitable puppies bouncing, a 3-legged mutt licking the bars. But none of them called to him, until he heard it. A sound that wasn't quite a bark or whine, but something lower, a quiet, trembling whimper. It sliced through the noise like a memory. Henry paused, turning his head slowly. The sound had come from the far end. Kennel number 8. He walked closer. The tag read, "Male, German Shepherd, approx. 3 years old, blind, surrendered. No name given." Inside, curled into the farthest corner of the kennel, was a German Shepherd. His sable coat was thick but dulled with dust, his body thin but not emaciated. His eyes were hidden beneath a deep green cloth gently tied around his head like a blindfold, the edges frayed from wear. One of his ears twitched as Henry approached. Then he lifted his head. The dog's nose quivered, catching scent. Then, a shift. The whimper grew louder, the body straightened, and then, with startling speed, the dog scrambled forward, pressing himself against the cage door, tail thumping so fast it made the metal rattle. Henry froze. Shadow. The name broke from his throat before he could stop it. A name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. The dog cried, truly cried, yelps laced with joy and panic. He pawed the bars wildly, pressing his face as close as he could from beneath the green blindfold. Tears streamed down his muzzle. Sarah had come up behind Henry, clipboard in hand, startled by the commotion. "Do you know him?" Henry knelt down, his hands trembling as he reached toward the bars. Shadow sniffed his fingers, then licked them frantically, tail wagging in a blur of sound. "I raised him," Henry said, voice breaking. "From a pup. He was mine." Shadow barked once, sharp, high, desperate. It was all the proof anyone needed. Sarah looked down at her clipboard. "He came in 3 weeks ago. No microchip. A man said he found him near the coastal road after a storm." Henry's voice was tight. "That was where we lost him. A car crash. I was knocked unconscious. When I woke up in the hospital, he was gone." Behind them, in the quiet lobby just past the office door, a girl sat on a bench beside a rain-spotted window. Emma Cole, 12 years old, hunched in her oversized hoodie with the sleeves pulled over her hands. Her auburn hair fell in uneven strands across her cheeks, half hiding the soft, freckled face beneath. Her backpack lay unopened beside her, and in her lap, she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit with one button eye. Emma had not spoken more than a sentence to anyone in weeks. She had arrived 3 days ago from Boston, sent to live with her grandfather Henry after her parents' divorce turned bitter. Her father had moved away. Her mother was unraveling. Emma had built walls faster than anyone could catch up. But now she turned toward the noise. The sound of the dog's cries, wild but joyful, stirred something in her. She stood, quietly, unnoticed, and peered down the hallway toward kennel number 8. Shadow had finally stopped crying. He pressed his forehead against Henry's fingers, a low hum of contentment vibrating in his chest. Henry leaned closer, resting his forehead against the cool metal gate. "I thought I'd never see you again." Behind him, Sarah cleared her throat softly. "We'll need to verify a few things. Maybe sit down. Go over the paperwork." Henry nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the dog. Whatever it takes. Shadow didn't need to see to know he was home. The scent, the voice, the warmth of the man who had once been his whole world. They were here again, and this time, he wasn't letting go. Henry sat across from Sarah Briggs in the small consultation room at the back of the shelter. The walls were lined with framed photos of adopted pets, faded by sunlight, and a potted fern sagged in the corner as if it too had grown weary of waiting. Shadow lay curled up beneath the table, his head resting on Henry's worn boot, though blind. The German Shepherd didn't seem lost. His ears flicked at every sound Henry made, voice, breath, even the shuffle of jacket fabric, and his tail gave a slow, rhythmic thump with every quiet reassurance. Sarah adjusted her glasses and scanned the intake forms again. Her lips pressed into a line. She had seen many reunions, but never one quite like this. Shadow, who hadn't eaten a full meal since his arrival, had finished a bowl of kibble moments after being brought into the room with Henry. His whining had ceased, replaced by the soft sighs of comfort that only come when something broken begins to mend. "I want to take him home," Henry said simply, his voice calm but resolute. Sarah looked up. "Mr. Cole?" "Henry, I don't doubt that you two have a strong bond, but Shadow has needs. He's blind. He'll require consistent guidance, regular veterinary checkups, and, depending on his anxiety levels, maybe even behavior therapy. Are you in a place where you can commit to?" That Henry took a breath, slow and controlled. "I'm not as young as I used to be. I won't pretend otherwise. But I raised him from a pup. I know how he moves. He knows how I move. We understand each other in ways that don't require seeing." Before Sarah could respond, the door creaked open and a new voice entered the room. "You must be Henry Cole," said a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a tidy braid down her back. She wore a navy windbreaker embroidered with the shelter's emblem and carried a medical clipboard tucked under one arm. Her name badge read, "Dr. Lillian March, Staff Veterinarian." March had an air of quiet intensity. Her face bore deep lines around the eyes, signs of long hours and too many hard choices. But her movements were precise, as if every gesture had a purpose. She gave Henry a small smile and crouched beside Shadow without hesitation, her fingers lightly brushing the green blindfold, checking the tightness. "He's been lethargic for days," she murmured, barely eating, barely responding. "Until today." Shadow lifted his head toward her touch, then turned instinctively toward Henry, letting out a low, contented whine. Dr. March observed silently. "I ran his vitals twice after you arrived," she said. "Standing, heart rate improved, appetite returned. He even allowed two unfamiliar staff to approach him without cowering. That's not coincidence. That's attachment, recognition. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You think it's enough to justify an adoption, I think. Dr. March said, placing the clipboard on the table, that we're looking at a textbook case for a therapy pairing, emotional support animal for a senior citizen. If Henry agrees to follow a care protocol, I'd recommend conditional release, home evaluation, weekly check-ins. But yes, from a medical standpoint, this dog is better with him. Henry stroked Shadow's back slowly. I'll agree to anything that lets me bring him home. Out in the lobby, Emma sat cross-legged on the tiled floor near the entrance, her stuffed rabbit resting in her lap. She wasn't supposed to be listening, but the slightly ajar door had allowed the muffled voices to reach her ears. Emma had remained mostly silent since arriving in Harbor Ridge 3 days earlier, communicating through shrugs and nods, but she was watching, from her spot. She could just barely make out Shadow's tail, occasionally wagging beside the table leg. Something about that dog pulled at her. It wasn't just the color of the blindfold, which was the exact green she used to shade the trees in her drawings, but something else, a familiarity. Like he had stepped out of the pictures she'd drawn in Boston. She'd never told anyone, but she had once dreamed about a dog with eyes like hers, eyes that didn't look, but listened. A foghorn moaned faintly from the harbor. Shadow's ears perked, head tilting toward the sound. Emma noticed. She hugged her rabbit tighter. That same sound had appeared in one of her old sketches. A dog sitting beside a window, ears angled at the fog. No one had ever understood that picture, but this dog did. She was sure of it. Later that afternoon, Henry stood at the reception desk, signing paperwork. Sarah handed over a folder labeled Foster Protocol Agreement. Inside were instructions, contact numbers, a feeding chart, and a short document explaining the basics of emotional support pairings for seniors. Dr. March had included a note at the bottom. Monitor signs of overstimulation or anxiety. Reassess in 14 days. You'll need a home inspection within the next week, Sarah said, tapping the packet, and check-ins every few days to start. We're not trying to make it hard, just making sure everyone's safe. Henry nodded, understood. Emma wandered over slowly, staying a few feet behind her grandfather. Her gaze never left Shadow, who now sat patiently on a short leash by Henry's side, his blindfold tied snug and clean. The old green cloth had been gently washed by a volunteer named Melissa, a petite college student who hadn't spoken much but had a soft spot for sad-eyed dogs. She'd added a little heart embroidered in the corner, something no one noticed except Emma. Emma, Henry said, turning slightly. This is Shadow. Emma didn't speak, but she reached out her hand, palm up. Shadow sniffed once, then leaned forward and rested his chin in her palm. Sarah blinked. He doesn't usually do that with strangers. Henry looked at Emma, then back at the dog. Maybe she's not a stranger. Dr. March watched from the hallway, arms folded. You're not just taking home a dog, she said softly to Sarah. You're reuniting a family, outside. The fog had thickened again, brushing against the windows like a memory returning. As Henry opened the shelter door and Shadow stepped forward, tail swaying behind him, Emma followed without being asked. She clutched her rabbit in one hand and Shadow's leash in the other, for the first time since arriving in Harbor Ridge. She didn't look back. The house at the edge of Shoreline Avenue stood unchanged. Weathered gray shingles curled slightly at the corners from years of coastal wind. White trim faded by salt and sun. A wraparound porch faced the sea, and the windows, though small, gathered light like glass jars catching fireflies. When Henry stepped through the door with Shadow by his side, something unspoken settled in the air. The blindfolded dog paused, nostrils flaring, as if every fiber in his body was recalling this place. Then he took a slow, careful step forward, his front paws moving in small arcs, brushing the floor with muscle memory more than vision. Henry watched, heart aching, as Shadow walked a few paces, then turned left, right where the kitchen began. The dog paused, sniffed, and sat by the lower cabinet that once held his treat box. Still remember. Huh, Henry said softly, closing the door behind them. The walls held echoes of a quieter life, where the smell of Margaret's rosemary bread lingered in the corners and soft jazz played in the evenings. Henry hadn't changed the arrangement of the house since her passing, partly out of grief, partly out of fear that moving even a chair would somehow erase her. But now, watching shadows settle on the faded rug in front of the fireplace, Henry felt something other than pain. Emma stood silently by the doorway, her backpack still on one shoulder, clutching her rabbit by the ear. Her eyes followed Shadow's movements, not with curiosity, but with recognition. She didn't speak, just slipped off her shoes and walked barefoot into the living room. She sat down a few feet from the dog and pulled her knees to her chest, the rabbit tucked between them. Henry let her be. He'd learned quickly that Emma didn't respond well to questions, or even gentle invitations. She needed space. What surprised him was how. After 10 minutes of sitting quietly, Shadow shifted his body so his flank touched her foot. Emma didn't flinch. She just looked down at the contact and gave the faintest nod. The next few days passed in a rhythm Henry hadn't expected. Shadow woke early, padding slowly around the house in deliberate, sniff-guided circles. He found his water bowl, the edge of the couch, the doorway to the back porch, each rediscovered step a triumph of scent and memory. Henry moved with quiet patience, always keeping his voice present, letting Shadow follow the warmth of his footsteps. On the third morning, Henry stood at the base of the stairs and called softly. Walk Shadow lifted his head, tail swaying. Emma appeared a few moments later, still barefoot, a notebook tucked under one arm. She didn't speak, but she followed them out the door. The path to the beach was little more than a trail carved by boots and sea wind. Seagrass lined the edges, swaying like whispers. Shadow walked steadily, his head low, sniffing every drift of sand and stone. Henry kept a steady pace, cane in one hand, leash in the other. The tide was low, and the beach stretched wide like a silver mirror. Emma walked a few feet behind, sketch pad open, her pencil moving with slow confidence. The wind tangled her hair, but she didn't tuck it away. She watched everything. They walked in silence until Shadow stopped abruptly. His body stiffened, ears twitching, tail frozen mid-sway. Henry felt the tension through the leash and followed the dog's lead, slowing until they stood together. The spot was unremarkable, just a dip in the dunes, bordered by a huddle of beach grass. But Henry knew this place. It was where the accident happened, where the car had spun, rolled, and come to rest in a spray of shattered glass and dune sand, where he had been found, unconscious, where Shadow had vanished. The memory hit him like a wave, Margaret's laugh echoing in the salt air, the screech of tires, the sudden silence. He closed his eyes, the wind pressing against his chest like a hand. Shadow whined, not loudly, but with a drawn-out exhale, and sat on the damp sand. He turned his blind face toward Henry, as if sensing everything. Emma watched from a few feet back, her pencil still. She looked from Henry to Shadow, then stepped forward slowly. She knelt beside the dog, resting her hand gently on his back. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice fragile and thin, but clear. "We're all still here." That night. Henry sat in his armchair beside the fireplace, a mug of tea in hand. The house was quiet, the wind rattling faintly outside. Shadow lay curled on the rug again, nose twitching in his sleep. Emma sat cross-legged nearby, sketching. She hadn't left the room since they returned. Every so often, she'd glance at the dog, as if to confirm he was still there. Henry watched her carefully, grateful but cautious. She hadn't spoken to him directly, but that whisper on the beach had been her first true voice since arriving. "Would you like some cocoa?" he asked gently. Emma paused, then shook her head. But she didn't get up to leave. A few minutes passed, then her pencil stopped moving. She looked up from the page, her eyes soft. "I miss my dad." Her words floated into the room like smoke, quiet, unexpected, almost sacred. Shadow lifted his head, turned, and crawled closer to her. He laid his head in her lap. Emma didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she set her sketchbook aside and curled her arms around the dog's neck. No tears, just the tight, silent hold of someone who'd been waiting too long for something to hold on to. Henry looked away, blinking hard, from the corner of the room. The sea wind crept in through the old chimney, carrying with it the scent of salt and rosemary, somewhere in that house by the sea. 3 quiet hearts had begun the long, gentle process of healing, each remembering in their own way that not all who are broken remain lost. The fog rolled in, heavy and low, over Harbor Ridge, swallowing the coastline and ghosting through the trees like a slow-moving tide. It pressed against the windows of Henry's home, smudging the world beyond into a blur of gray and silver inside. The warmth from the fireplace kept the damp at bay, but unease had taken root in the room long before the weather changed. Henry stood by the kitchen counter, arms crossed over his chest, staring at the folded letter on the table, a legal notice, hand-delivered an hour earlier by a man with impatient eyes and an ill-fitting suit. Shadow lay by the doorway, his green blindfold in place, head tilted as if sensing something just beneath the surface. The letter was from a man named Caleb Turner, 28 years old, a part-time mechanic from a neighboring county, according to the document. He had taken Shadow in months ago when the dog was found wandering near a rural road, but within weeks, Caleb realized the dog was blind, difficult, and not suitable for protection or work. Instead of returning him properly or seeking help, Caleb abandoned him near a trailhead in the Pine Hollow forest, hoping the dog would figure it out or be found by someone else. That was where Shadow had eventually been picked up by a hiker and brought to the shelter. Now, Caleb was trying to reclaim him. He had seen a picture of Shadow on the shelter's website during a donor feature, recognized the green blindfold, and sent in a formal claim of ownership. His reasoning: I fed him. I sheltered him. He's mine. Henry's jaw tightened as he read the letter again. Across the room, Emma sat on the floor beside Shadow, running her fingers along the dog's back with slow, steady movements. She hadn't said much since the envelope arrived, but her face had gone pale, her eyes unusually still. I'm not letting him take Shadow, Henry said aloud, more to himself than anyone else. But what if they make you... Emma's voice was barely more than a whisper. She didn't look up. Henry turned to her, voice softening. They won't. We'll fight it. Just then, a knock came at the door. Sarah Briggs stood on the porch, coat soaked from the mist, her curly hair tied up tightly beneath a hood. Her expression was grim. Behind her stood a second figure, Detective Alan Moresby, a tall man in his late 50s with thinning hair, a kind face, and a habit of squinting as if reading people like books. He wore a dark brown raincoat and held a clipboard in his left hand. I wish we were visiting under better circumstances, Sarah said as Henry let them in. Detective Moresby nodded. This is an unusual situation. Mr. Cole, the shelter contacted us to confirm chain of custody after Mr. Turner filed his complaint. We're not here to take the dog yet, but we are required to place Shadow under temporary protective care while this is reviewed. No, Emma said suddenly. Her voice cut the room clean in half. Sarah looked down at the girl with a mix of sympathy and concern. Emma, sweetheart. You don't understand, Emma continued, rising to her feet. He's the only one who listens. He's not just a dog. He's my only real friend. Detective Moresby sighed. I'm not trying to be the villain here. We just need to move Shadow to a holding home while this is sorted. Henry, you can visit. It may only be a few days. But Henry's eyes had darkened with something deeper than frustration. He was abandoned, left blind in the woods. Caleb Turner has no right to him. And that's what the review will look into, Sarah said gently. We're just asking for cooperation. Later that evening, as Sarah and the detective left to begin the transfer arrangements, the fog thickened to the point where even the front yard disappeared in a veil of white. Emma had gone quiet again. Henry sat at the kitchen table, shoulders heavy, but when he turned to ask Emma if she wanted tea, she was gone, Shadow too. The back door was ajar. Panic sparked through him like lightning. He shouted her name, once, twice, but only fog answered, grabbing his coat and flashlight. He stepped into the heavy white air, calling again. Emma had taken the flashlight from the emergency drawer and packed a small knapsack. She held Shadow's leash in one hand, but didn't use it. The dog walked beside her, close and careful, as if he could feel her fear. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that she couldn't let them take him. She followed the narrow trail behind the house that led toward the dunes, and, beyond that, her grandfather's old fishing shack, the one he used when clamming years ago. It was barely a shelter anymore, just 4 walls of warped wood and a tarped roof. But she remembered it from stories and pictures. It was enough. By the time the search team was organized, it had been 2 hours. The fog had turned the town into a maze. Detective Moresby called in a local tracker. Sarah returned in her truck with warm blankets and thermoses of soup. Henry, despite his cane and weak knee, refused to sit still. He walked the edge of the shore, calling for her until his voice broke. It was just past midnight when they found them. The fishing shack stood like a memory on the bluff, barely more than shadow against the gray. Inside, Emma lay curled against Shadow, who slept with his head on her lap, tail thumping faintly even in sleep. She was humming something, soft and tuneless, a lullaby made of breath and comfort, when the flashlight beam swept over her. She didn't flinch. "I just wanted to keep him safe," she said, looking up at her grandfather. "You did," Henry whispered. "You did. Baby girl." Detective Moresby lowered his flashlight and said nothing more. The courtroom in Brunswick County wasn't large or grand, but its wood-paneled walls and tall windows lent it a quiet authority. The ceiling fans hummed overhead as morning light filtered through linen drapes, dust motes catching the beams like falling snow. At the front, Judge Miriam Devereaux, a woman in her early 60s with short silver curls and glasses perched low on her nose, peered over a stack of papers. Known for her firm but empathetic rulings, Judge Devereaux had a reputation for listening with both ears and heart, traits shaped by raising 2 boys alone while putting herself through law school after her husband passed. Caleb Turner sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table. He wore a wrinkled navy button-up and a scowl that barely hid his discomfort. His lawyer, Rick Yates, looked younger than his tie, a loud, overconfident, tan, and visibly annoyed by the rustic feel of the courtroom. Across from them sat Henry Cole, spine straight despite the cane leaning on the chair beside him. Next to him was Sarah Briggs, shelter coordinator, in her usual blazer over jeans, hands folded in her lap, and beside her, taking quiet notes and offering the occasional reassuring nod, was Dr. Lillian March, the veterinarian whose report had become the cornerstone of the case. At Henry's feet lay Shadow, curled patiently, green blindfold tied clean and snug, though he could not see. His posture was calm, head up each time Henry spoke, ears trained to the voice he'd never forgotten. A therapy dog in practice, if not yet in law. The courtroom had already heard testimony from Sarah about the intake conditions, and from Dr. March, who described the depression and malnourishment Shadow had suffered after being surrendered. Then came the words that carried the most weight, not from a shelter worker or doctor, but from someone wearing scuffed sneakers and a backpack that looked too big for her shoulders. Emma. She stood hesitantly at the podium, fingers tightening on the edge, her stuffed rabbit tucked into her bag at her feet, for a moment. Silence pressed down on the room like fog, but when she spoke, it was with a voice both soft and certain. "He doesn't need to see to know where he belongs," she said, her gaze fixed not on the judge, but on Shadow. "When I couldn't talk to anyone, not even my grandpa, he listened. He never barked or growled. He just stayed. That green blindfold doesn't mean he's broken. It means he's brave." When Emma stepped down, Judge Devereaux adjusted her glasses and took a long pause before delivering her decision. "The court finds no legal grounds to return Shadow to Mr. Turner. Evidence of neglect, abandonment, and emotional trauma far outweighs any temporary possession Mr. Turner may have had. Further, based on documentation submitted by Dr. March and the accompanying psychiatric evaluation provided by Dr. Helen Strauss, a licensed child psychologist, the court hereby recognizes Shadow as an emotional support animal for Mr. Henry Cole under state statute. Henry exhaled as if for the first time in weeks. Beside him, Shadow let out a small sigh, resting his head on Henry's foot. Caleb muttered something inaudible as he left, but no one paid him attention. 3 days later, Harbor Ridge Elementary held its annual Courage and Kindness Assembly in the school's modest auditorium. Folding chairs filled the space. parents leaning in with their phones ready while teachers herded nervous children backstage. Emma sat in the wings, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a pale yellow cardigan and a skirt with faded sunflowers, her hair braided by Sarah that morning. Her rabbit was nowhere in sight, but beside her sat Shadow, green blindfold still in place, wearing a soft gray vest that read, "Certified ESA, do not pet." He didn't need a leash. He never strayed from her side. Their names were called. She walked slowly to the center of the stage, Shadow matching her step for step. Gasps and murmurs fluttered through the audience. Some recognized the story. Others simply moved by the image of the blind dog and the girl whose eyes now held something quiet but unshakable. She didn't use notes. "My name is Emma," she said, gripping the microphone. "And this is Shadow. He's not like the other dogs. He can't see the world, but he feels it. When I couldn't speak, he listened. When I was afraid, he laid beside me. He never tried to fix me or tell me I was wrong. He just stayed. A pause. Sometimes the strongest hearts don't need eyes. They just need someone to hold on to." Applause swelled, not loud or showy, but heartfelt. Henry stood in the back row, blinking hard. Sarah wiped tears and nudged Dr. March, who was already clapping. That night, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long golden rays across Shoreline Avenue, Henry brewed tea in the kitchen, while Emma finished her sketch at the living room table. Shadow lay on the rug in front of the fire, paws tucked neatly beneath his body. The green blindfold remained tied, frayed slightly now at the corners. Emma had stitched a small heart onto one edge, like the one the volunteer once added at the shelter, but now surrounded by tiny embroidered stars. Henry returned to the room with 2 mugs and sat beside the fire. "You were brave today," he said. Emma shrugged, but her smile gave her away. Outside, the wind swept gently through the pine trees. Inside, warmth spread not just from the fire, but from something that had taken root in the walls of the home: belonging, safety, trust. Emma leaned against her grandfather's shoulder. "Do you think Shadow dreams?" Henry looked at the sleeping dog, chest rising and falling steadily. "I think he does," he said softly. "And I think tonight, he'll dream of you." And so, the house grew quiet. The flames danced, and the dog, who once wandered blind and alone, now rested in the place he knew best, not because he could see it, but because he could feel every heartbeat of it. Sometimes, the ones who guide us through the darkness are not those who see the world with their eyes, but those who feel it deeply with their hearts. Shadow couldn't see, but he never stopped believing in the voice that once loved him. And Emma, broken in ways no one could see, found healing in a dog who asked for nothing but to stay beside her. That is not just a story. That is a miracle. In a world that often moves too fast to notice the quiet souls, this story reminds us that God's grace can come in the form of a paw pressed against your chest, or a child finding her voice beside the warmth of love. It teaches us that love doesn't need sight. It needs faith. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs hope. Comment below and let us know your thoughts. And if you believe, like we do, that God places angels in fur to remind us we are never truly alone, then write amen in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories of love, second chances, and quiet miracles. May God bless you and those you love.